Good morning, everyone. I'm here with Sebastian or Seb from Spatie, and we're going to talk about event sourcing in PHP. But first, Seb, maybe quickly introduce yourself.
Good morning. I'm Seb. I'm a full stack developer at Spatie. I've been working there for 8 years already. It's been a while. Full stack developer. Lately, been doing a lot more backend work though. And specifically, the project I'm working on is also using a lot of event sourcing. So that's why I'm here to talk with Brent about what I like about it generally.
Yeah, because Seb and you and I were colleagues for almost 5 years before I moved to JetBrains, and we actually did work together a little bit on this event sourcing project. And I wasn't there when it went to production. And a couple of weeks ago, I asked you, "Hey Seb, how is it going with that project?" Because it was fairly new thing we were doing with Laravel and event sourcing. And I wanted to have this conversation with you about the lessons that you've learned and the things you've come across when implementing event sourcing in a real life and rather big project, right?
Yeah.
But first, maybe we should start with quickly describing what event sourcing is. What's the easiest way you can come up with to explain event sourcing?
All right. So I think the easiest way to explain it is kind of to compare it to what we usually do and how event sourcing does things differently. So usually when we build an application, we model our database, we think a lot about the data structure we want in our database. And that data structure generally represents what the data looks like right now. So I'm going to use a really simple example, like a blog post or something. When you have a system, you create a blog post. The blog post table will contain like the blog post content at this point in time, the date it was published, and so on and so forth. When you update that blog post, all that data will be replaced with, again, what the blog post looks like at the point of updating it. So you don't really have any context of how it got there. You only store what it looks like right now. With event sourcing, you first store what is happening. So you store events. You store what the user is doing or what is happening in the system. So we don't store a blog post, but we store an event that says blog post was created. And inside that event, we have a bunch of data relevant to that event, a payload of some sorts. So in a blog post created event, we would have information like this is the content, this is the user that created it, this is the publish date that was set for now or the future. But you can't really do much with an event in itself. Like it's not something you can easily query because when working with your data, you do care about what does it look like right now, not how did it get here. So whenever an event gets created in the system, it goes through a bunch of moving parts, which we can dive into deeper later. But it eventually ends up looking the same way as what we're used to in your data blog post with what it looks like right now. When a blog post gets updated, we'd get like a blog post updated event and would in turn update the data in the database like we're used to. So the benefit there is that we have a full context of how we got to where we are right now. So we don't just know what does the blog post look like right now. We know what did it look like in the past and how did it get to what it looks like right now. I think that's like the key part of event sourcing that describes the architecture.
Yeah, great. Because you mentioned these moving parts, and there are a lot of moving parts that make all of this work. But essentially, what you're saying is you have the same end result, but you have additional information of how you got to that end result, and you can do things with that additional information as well, right?
Yeah.
So many people, when they first hear about this paradigm, they're like, it sounds like a lot of overhead. Why would you want to do this? What are the real life benefits. And maybe you want to, before answering that, maybe you can share a little bit about this project that you've been building at Spatie for quite a while now. You chose event sourcing for specific reasons, I can imagine. Can you share a bit about that?
So yeah, the project we're working on is a pretty broad project. There are like a lot of different parts of it, of the application. For example, there's a web shop section. There's a part that manages registrations for events, and so on and so forth. When we say that we used event sourcing for that project, we didn't write that project in a completely different way than we would regularly write a project. I would say like 75 to 80% of the code in that project is it's a Laravel project, is Laravel like we're used to, like with models, and yeah, we use a lot of actions in our Laravel code. Just regular Laravel, a regular Laravel project. But we decided to use event sourcing for like 20% of it. We decided because, like you said, there is like event sourcing is not something that you do without overhead. Like you said, there is a lot more work to set it up, to understand it. I'll get back to that later too. But we decided to only use event sourcing where it makes sense in that project. That's also something cool that was kind of a risk. Like, would that work out or not? To do it like partially event sourced, partially not. Would that work well together? Turns out it does. So you can decide to just cherry pick parts of your application. Like, I'm going to build this part in an event sourced way.
Yeah. Yeah. So for example, the blog post, it's an easy thing to understand for everyone, of course, but maybe that's not the best thing to event source in such a real life project, because you might not be really interested in the historic data attached to it.
Yeah, well, but that depends. If you're building like blog posts, we think of like small developer blogs, and maybe when you use the word blog. But if we're talking about like you're building a CMS for a news website, for example, then maybe that data is very important for your business. So then it could make sense. So it's not only like how do I say this? It doesn't really matter what content you're event sourcing, but more like, do I need the information or the benefits that event sourcing give me for this in this context?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so like one of the first things we decided that we definitely want to event source in this project we're working on was orders, because the web shop is an important part. There's a complex way of dealing with calculations and how you get to a certain calculation for a price for a user and so on and so forth. So we cared about that enough to say, okay, this warrants an event-sourced architecture. If you're building an application where your web shop is only like a very small part of it, that's like a not really super important business data, that you could say, okay, I'm going to build this order system without event sourcing. Yeah. So to me, it depends more on the context towards the business than what you're building technically.
One of the benefits that I remember as well is that you have one event stream where an order is made eventually, and probably items get added to some kind of cart, and people pay their order, and that's probably an event as well. I'm oversimplifying, of course. The end result is an order, basically. But you can make a totally different end result besides that order from that same event stream, right? You could make like a chart, or I don't know. Is this something you're using in this project as well?
Actually, it is, but only afterwards. And this is, now I'm going to jump to like a huge benefit of event sourcing.
Okay.
So we have the order system. We built it all. So just to give a vague idea of what it looks like, for example, someone adds something to an order, or to a cart, I'll say, then you have an item added to cart event. Someone removes it, you have an item removed from cart event. Someone checks out, cart checked out, someone pays, cart paid, and so on and so forth. That means that when you add something or change something in your cart, we have all that information in the event stream. We don't necessarily have it in our data model. So we don't have in our data model, like these are items that were in the cart at some point and then removed because we didn't care about that information. So we didn't store that in the data model for orders. But we do have that information in the events. So the system was running for, I don't know, 9 months to a year, something. Everything was going fine. And as we were building new features, we came to a point like we don't have enough information in our data model. Like we don't, just knowing what is in an order today is enough to, for example, make the correct decisions towards the accounting system. We also need to know which items were in the order in the past because they might have payments, but they're not in our data model right now.
Yeah.
So then we built a new data structure for our orders that made more sense for our needs then. That was more complex. So I'm glad we didn't build it from the get-go because it would have made the scope too big. But when we had time for it later, we were able to build it out and build out a better system. And we could use our events from the past to hydrate it. So yeah, we didn't need to worry about, okay, we have a new system, but it only works for orders created from now on because we're storing more data now. No, we already had the data, but we used it as a source for a different data structure that we're going to use in the application. And another benefit of that is we didn't need to do the switch like in one go. We didn't need to do like this massive refactor and super scary deploy. No, because the old data structure, we just kept it as is. We built a new data structure alongside it and had that data hydrated in the meantime. We reviewed it. And once we said, okay, this is at a good point right now, we're ready to make the switch, we make the switch. And so it's really a huge benefit also that you can do these kind of things gradually. And you don't need to do this like super scary migration where you're going to transform all your data and might lose things or whatever. You can just, it makes it easier to run things side by side because your data structure is decoupled from the source of your data.
It's actually so cool to hear because I helped think about the setup of this project conceptually when I still worked at Spatie. But to hear that this actually happened in production. Now, this was always the goal, of course. This is why we chose event sourcing, but it's great to hear that it's actually working and serving a purpose in real life. That's because the thing with event sourcing is, like, I also did quite a lot of research on the topic. It's always very theoretical, right, when you learn about it, because it's often used in large and complex projects because it has an overhead and you really need good use cases for it, which tends to happen in larger projects more often. So it's difficult to like give real life examples that make sense to people. But I think you're doing a great job with it, and it's actually really great to hear how it's being used right now. I do wonder about one thing, because I mentioned large projects. You're storing basically every interaction in the database as an event, and then you're making projections based on those events. Do you have any numbers on what size we're talking about? Because I can imagine your database is growing quite large at the moment, with all those events just piling up.
So it's a multi-tenant system, so they each have their own database. But like one, which helps a lot, because then it's easier to work with a few smaller data sets than one massive one when you are querying or doing whatever with it. I would say that right now we're around between 10 to 20 million events per tenant, which is not too bad. Like, and it's using MySQL. We're not using some kind of special event storage system, because there are more specialized systems for this kind of data. But we're definitely not even close to a point that MySQL doesn't give us enough for what we need. And that's also a reason why it's worth thinking about what parts do and do I not want to event source of a system, because it means you can like we don't need to worry about moving towards something a lot more complex infrastructure-wise than MySQL because we don't event source the entire system.
Yeah.
If you would event source the entire system, then yeah, there would be a lot more developer overhead. And also you would have scaling issues sooner with your event stores. Scaling issues they're easy to solve by moving to a different technology, but I'm glad that we're able to stick with MySQL for as long as we can.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things we conceptualized as well, but I wonder if there are actual use cases for it at the moment. You have projections of those events, but you also have the events themselves stored in a database. In theory, you could query those events themselves to get like temporal information. Is this something you've already run into, or not?
We haven't queried them like live yet. We have only queried them for like the example I just gave, where we decided to use past events for a new type of data.
Yeah.
But it's not really practical to query a data set that large, especially because the payload is in the case of, I think that's also the package default, right? So we use our event sourcing package that we built at Spatie. I think the default way that the payloads of the events are stored in the database is PHP serialized, which is not easy to query. It's a kind of it's a system of its own. That's also something that we want to move away from at some point, that we store them as JSON instead of PHP serialized data. That's a work in progress for both the package and projects that we event source in.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to drop some words now, because you mentioned projections, but we never really talked about like the terminology in event sourcing. So in event sourcing, you have your events, which you record when something happens. So a user adds something to a cart, then we record an item was added to cart event, for example, which would contain a payload, which is the user ID, the item ID, and maybe some other context, whatever makes sense for the business or could make sense for the business. I think generally you want to store it's better to store too much than not enough in your events, because they're cheap to store. And if you can use it later, then you might be able to use it later.
Yeah.
So what happens then is whenever an event gets stored, there are a bunch of listeners. Different libraries use different terminology sometimes. I'm going to use the terminology we use in our event sourcing package. There are two types of listeners. There are projectors and there are reactors. Now, a projector, you mentioned projections a minute ago. A projector is the class that essentially transforms the data that came from an event to the data type that you want in your database. So when item was added to cart, it would go through some cart projector, for example, and that would then write in your probably MySQL database a cart item assigned to a user, assigned to an item with the correct foreign keys. And the projections are what you're reading in your application. So event sourcing takes care of writing data, and it writes it to most likely a database. And then you read your database, in the case of Laravel, with just plain Eloquent models like you're used to. So with Laravel, we're still using Eloquent in event sourcing, but you only use Eloquent to read data. You don't use Eloquent to write data, except in your projections. Another type of handler is a reactor. When an event happens, I'm going to use a different one now. For example, cart was paid. Cart was paid happen. First, it will go through the projectors to mark the cart or order row as paid, paid at, how much was paid, and so on and so forth. After it went through all projectors, it will go through reactors. And reactors take care of side effects. So when it goes through a reactor, the reactor would be, for example, user email reactor. And that would send an email to the user when the cart gets paid. The difference between the two is projectors our event sourcing package also has the necessary infrastructure for that. You can replay events through projectors. So if you wrote a bug, and for example, you stored the wrong date in your final data structure of the paid date of the order, for example, you can theoretically delete that data and run the events through a projector again after fixing the projector, so you have the correct data in the database. So projectors need to be written in a way that they transform data. Reactors are written as this only happens once when the event occurs, and after that, we never want to do that again. If you would replay your events that an order was paid, you don't want to send the user a second email that their order was paid, like maybe 2 years later or something. That would be weird. So that's the difference between projectors and reactors.
Cool. Did you like the project has been in production for a year now, I think you mentioned?
About a year and a half almost.
Okay.
Yeah, a year and a few months, yeah.
Okay. It sounds all great. And it sounds like event sourcing is really helping in the areas where it was used chosen to actually be there for a specific use case. And it seems like event sourcing is really solving those problems. Did you run into any difficulties as well now that the project has been in production, or maybe during development?
Like we said, there is overhead to writing event source code. It's easier to insert a single row in the database with Eloquent or with whatever ORM you're using than saying, okay, I need to handle this action. I need to create an event. I need to create or update a projector. I need to create the final data structure. I need to think about what I want to store in the event. There's a lot more work to it. You don't always know ahead of time if that's worth it too. So yeah, I just told a success story about like the orders that we were able to reuse that data for a different data structure. There are also parts we event sourced that we haven't really used much benefits, like event sourcing benefits from. I mean, it's not bad that it is event sourced, but when we do want to make changes to that part of the system, it does mean that it's harder to make those changes. So that's one thing we came across. But that's probably like, that's not a huge problem. It's just it's a risk. It can be a risk in a way to decide to event source something. But if you want to be able to move quicker or smoother in the future in that part of the system, it is bringing overhead. That overhead also is relevant when you're onboarding new developers to a project that are not used to event sourcing. It does require some learning, like you need to read through enough documentation and just understand the concepts of event sourcing before actually being proficient enough to easily make changes in that code. If your entire team is used to event sourcing, that it's not an issue anymore. But it is something always like when we onboard new developers to an event source project that sometimes it takes a bit more time to get them on-ramped compared to your standard Laravel or whatever framework you're using project. Another thing, so I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but event sourcing optimizes for reading data. So because you can project your data in whatever structure you want, without having to worry about storing everything in the correct way for the future, you can project your data in a way that makes it very fast to read. And like I said, you can also have multiple projections of the same data. If you have two different screens that display the data in two different ways, in a traditional non-event source system, you need to think of a database diagram that would support those two views in a good enough way, because you want your queries to be fast enough for both situations. With event sourcing, you can make the decision to project it twice in two completely different tables, the same data, because you don't care about your source of truth, because your source of truth is the events, not any of the projections. And that means that you can optimize for reading data and make things very performant. The cost of that is that event sourcing is slow to write because you're storing events, you're storing a lot more data. It then needs to go through all those moving parts, the projectors, reactors, so on and so forth. That means that writing can be slower. And in some situations, that can lead to performance issues that you need to debug or think differently about how you're dealing with a certain problem when you're writing a lot of events in one go.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not all a success story, of course. Well, success story, that's not the right word, but it's very, very nice how you strike the balance between pros and cons. But that's, of course, with software design, always you make decisions, and maybe that's even the most interesting part of our job, because coding all of this is of course fun as well, but like understanding the problem space and being able to choose the right tool for the job, that's actually an important skill to have as a developer.
Yeah. Each, like you said, there's never a silver bullet. There are always trade-offs. And so far with event sourcing, I have been very happy to be able to use it. If we would build another similar type of project again, I would immediately grab the event sourcing because I'm really happy with the benefits we get from it. One more benefit I also didn't mention yet is and also a trade-off actually, is debugging. Debugging can be a lot easier with event sourcing because you have an exact record of how your data got to how it is. Like if you don't understand why the price of an order item is a certain value, for example, you can look back at the events and you'll see exactly which steps were made to get to that value. And that's debugging information that you don't have when you're building a traditional system, unless you add some sort of auditing or activity log system. But those auditing and activity log systems are not your source of truth. So you still don't really, you can't trust it as much as you can trust stored events. The trade-off of that is if you have a bug in your stored events, it's harder to solve. Because your source of truth suddenly contains wrong information. And you don't only, let's say that an order item has a wrong price, for example, for whatever reason. In a traditional system, you can fix that price column, like update the number, be done with it, move on. With event sourcing, you can't do that. You need to, because even if you fix that number today, if you reuse your events in the future for a different context, or you replay that order items column, your bug is going to reappear. So you don't only need to fix it in your projections, you also need to fix it in the source, in the events in some way.
I remember doing some reading on this part. It's a very tricky thing to change events or deal with that in one way or another. So because basically you're changing the historic record, you're changing time. I remember there are like dedicated event stores that simply don't allow that. If you have wrong data in your events, you'll have to add new events on top of that event stream to fix those issues in the past.
There are a lot of event sourcing people in the event sourcing community that are very strict on you are never allowed to update past events. Like when something happened, it's like it's like accounting. When you have a wrong number in accounting, you're not allowed to like strike through that number and write a new number in your ledger. You have to add another line that corrects that number. And that is one strategy to fix data in your event stream, which works sometimes. But what I don't always like about that strategy is that you still have at some point in time the wrong data in your stream. It depends on the type of bug too, but I don't really like that you have to, like, if I made a mistake in my event stream yesterday, that mistake is going to haunt me for the rest of the application lifetime if it doesn't get fixed in there, if you fix it in a different way. That's also one of the benefits of using like MySQL and using it at the scale we're using, because we're saying it's a big project, but like compared to like big event sourcing projects, this is like 10 to 20 million events is peanuts compared to like, I've heard stories about people using event sourcing and they wanted to replay their event store to create a new projection of the data. And it took like a week or something to process all the data. So you're not as flexible in changing past data and in a lot of other things if you're dealing with that scale of data. So as long as we're in the scale that we're working in, I'm not that afraid of updating previous events instead of always having to move forward.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, scale is relative, of course, because I can imagine for many Laravel developers and PHP developers in general, the project you're describing is already quite large. But definitely replays that take a week aren't uncommon in the event sourcing world. So how do you mentioned you like made another projection for orders and you had to replay. Did you have to replay production data as well?
So we wrote a migration that replayed all the past events and brought them to the new data structure. But like I said, it was not scary at all because we could do it side by side with the existing data.
Yeah.
And then we spent enough time validating, asking clients to look at reports, like, does it still look good on your end? And once it all was good, then we decided to make the switch. Yeah. And this is something we're going to do more in the future. Like we have another section of the application where when we built it, like we didn't understand the problem space enough when we built it. So typical problems, and you end up with a data structure that is like, either over-engineered or under-engineered.
Yeah.
We know that we're not crazy about that part. And at some point we are going to handle it differently. But we still have our events, which we can use as our source of truth for the new data structure that we're going to build at some point. So as long as we have our events stored correctly, then we can live with the non-ideal situation for now. And then when we have time, we can build the ideal situation. And with the same strategy, run it side by side, compare data, make sure everything's good. And when you're ready, make the switch.
Oh, cool. Do you remember how long it took to replay to the new projector when you did it in production? Because you mentioned other projects might take a week, but I can imagine this is you're talking about minutes or maybe hours.
No, it was hours. I want to say something between 1 and 4. Depending. It was also on a smaller tenant, so it also depends, of course, on how much data, how much historical data you are transforming. And it depends on the weight of the transformations. It's not, it depends on a lot of factors. But the migrations we've done in the past have generally been in the scale of hours, not days.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's already quite big for many Laravel projects, I can imagine. Pretty cool. Seb, what is the most fun thing you take away from event sourcing?
One thing I really enjoy about event sourcing is the structure. I feel like, and this is also especially true for certain problems, like when you have data that changes or grows over time, that you have your events that grow over time, and like the structure of having events, projectors, and reactors makes it very easy to me to know where a certain piece of code has to go or how it should be implementing. It's more work implementing it, but I feel like I have to think less about where am I going to put this piece of code. And that's something that I also enjoy a lot about event sourcing, is the structure it gives your project, and the consistency throughout different parts of your project, different event source parts of your project. But once you understand the structure of one, then it's easily to like understand another.
Yeah, I think for me, what I like about event sourcing is that it models the way we think about the world in a much more natural way than like basic CRUD operations where you
Yeah, definitely.
perform updates and things just change. When we're talking about going to the shop and filling our cart, it's I added this item and that item, and that's how my cart is full now, and why I'm going to the checkout counter, and then I pay, and like that event stream feels so very natural to think about.
Yeah. Without event sourcing, the only thing you have left at the end is like the slip that you get after paying.
Yeah, exactly.
But with event sourcing, you know exactly like when was something added to the cart, what did I put back in the aisle, and so on and so forth, which can be very interesting information to have.
Exactly.
And yeah, I guess what I also really like about that is that you don't need to overthink your data model too much before you start. Because like I said, if you don't record enough, if you record not enough information in a non-event source system, then it's lost forever.
Yeah.
With event sourcing, it's generally cheap to record a lot more metadata and context of where and how and when a decision was made in the application. Yeah. And even if you don't use that context today, you still have it pretty much cost-free to use in the future, because storing events is cheap.
Yes, cool. Are there any like random closing thoughts you wanted to share? Things that we might not have covered today?
I actually don't think so. I think we covered most of the things I wanted to talk about.
Cool.
So yeah, I'm happy with how the conversation went.
Nice. Seb, if people want to dive into event sourcing and take a closer look at how it works in practice, where should they go?
But yeah, I would refer to our resources for like how we use event sourcing.
Yeah.
We have a package, Laravel Event Sourcing, that you can install and play around with documentation. And we also have a book, Event Sourcing Laravel, that you can purchase to learn how to use event sourcing in your application. So cool. I think those are good places to start.
Nice. I'll leave a link in the description to all of those places.
Right. I also have, I think it was Drip FM or something, or Drip.io. I don't know, some company that used event sourcing in Ruby. And I remember that their blog post was like the first time we at Spatie really thought like, okay, this is something we can do and would be useful. Because we saw a lot of event sourcing talks and read a lot about event sourcing before. But that one blog article was like really, felt like really human compared to like, it wasn't like super technical like a lot of resources are. So I'll also share a link to that, because that's kind of what inspired us to start using event sourcing. So I think that's a good resource too.
Well, with all of that being said, Seb, thanks for being here and sharing a real life experience. I really liked how you brought some balance, and I hope people find it like this mystic topic a bit demystified now. And people can actually use event sourcing in real life projects with PHP and Laravel. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
Definitely. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.
All right. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.